Let's get started. My name's David Archer. I'm the head of programs with ActionAid's Global Secretariat. Delighted to welcome you all here for this webinar, which is jointly organised by a lot of different organisations. We have Debt for Climate, Donut Economics, CAN, Christian Aid, AfroDad, Eurodad, Latindad, Debt Justice, Equidad, De Género, Centre for Economic and Social Rights, Oil Change International, Third World Network. It's an impressive lineup of organizations and movements that are working in the climate justice space or in the debt justice space. And this is really a webinar about how these two crises are interconnected. I think many of you will have, presumably you joining this webinar is because you can see that these things are connected. Hopefully through the space of this webinar, some of those connections will become clear, and how we can work together across movements will also become clear. When I start my understanding of these connections, I think it's very much that, any country which is facing, look, we have 54 countries in debt crisis. We have two-thirds or 75% of lower income countries, that's low income and low middle income countries, either in debt crisis or at high or moderate risk of a debt crisis. And that debt crisis is diverting funding from health and education and climate responses. If you are a country in debt crisis, you're under massive pressure to earn foreign currencies to pay back your external debt. And this is something coercively enforced by the International Monetary Fund. And if you need to earn foreign currencies in the present global economy, that tends to mean that the easiest way to do that is to extract fossil fuels, extract other minerals, or invest in export-oriented industrial agriculture. And of course, these things, extraction of fossil fuels and industrial agriculture, are the biggest causes of the climate crisis. So being in debt crisis forces countries into pursuing paths that actually accelerate the climate crisis. And of course, if a country is in climate crisis, it is punished in international markets because it's seen to be a riskier place to invest in. And so if you are climate vulnerable, you end up getting charged higher interest rates on any loan that you do take out. And that means that you end up in an accelerated debt spiral much more quickly. And that is something particularly problematic because of the credit rating agencies who are sort of setting norms around interest rates it's reasonable to charge. There are so many different ways in which the climate crisis and debt crisis interconnect. And one of the places we wanted to start this webinar was looking at some of the data and the big picture of data. And we are joined here by Andrew Fanning from Donut Economics, who has co-authored with Jason Hickel one of the definitive works on trying to understand climate debt, because we're very focused on external debts that are enforced by the IMF and others, countries having to pay back their external debts. But in the much bigger picture, rich countries owe a climate debt to lower income countries, particularly to climate vulnerable countries. And it's a really amazing to have done the sort of serious crunching of data to figure out how much debt is owed. What is that climate debt of rich countries to low income vulnerable countries? Andrew co-authored, as I say, a definitive paper on that, on atmospheric appropriation, and it will all make beautiful sense as I hand over to Andrew now.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. And wow, it's a big honor for me to be here to discuss this urgent and important topic and to learn from the amazing lineup of speakers that you, David, and the other organizers have assembled. It's really a big honor. So my name is Andrew Fanning. I am the research and data analysis lead at Donut Economics Action Lab, which is an organization that I joined 5 years ago, shortly after it was co-founded by my colleagues Kate Rayworth and Carlota Sanz. Now I've been asked to share a data overview that tries to make visible the climate destabilization that our living planet is now facing, which includes critically the historical responsibilities that we see across countries and how this relates to the debt crisis. But I mean, I prepared some slides and with some charts and some figures. I'm kind of a data nerd, so that makes me that that keeps me motivated. But I really want to emphasize my view that data should always be seen as a tool that is in service to an underlying concept or a vision of the world that we're trying to make. And my overall aim is to create and share rigorous metrics that help make visible the interconnected social and ecological challenges that humanity faces in the 21st century, including climate breakdown and the debt crisis, and use these metrics to present a new economic narrative. So let me, with that, try to share my screen at the moment of truth. And I believe that should be working. Yes. And
Yeah.
let me just jump right in with the core thesis, as articulated by David and ActionAid colleagues in their recent Who Owes Who report. It is the shocking imbalance of global power that enables the external debts of lower income countries to be brutally enforced, whilst the climate debts of rich countries go largely unpaid and unenforced. I couldn't put it more succinctly. This is what we are up against, and it's already causing real harm for billions of people. Because we can feel that we're living in a world that is deeply out of balance. So this is the global donut of social and planetary boundaries. It was created by my colleague Kate Rayworth. It uses the best available data at the global scale to show humanity's progress towards the defining goal of the 21st century, in my view, meeting the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. And what we can see from all the red in this image, we want to be in that green donut-shaped space, and all the red shows that humanity is very far from achieving this goal. So billions of people are not meeting their most essential needs for food, education, health, political voice, and more. And yet humanity's collective pressure on our living planet is already overshooting multiple planetary boundaries for climate change, biodiversity loss, and others. So this image, it tells me that the current economic system, which is fundamentally based on expanding levels of debt, it needs to be fundamentally transformed to bring us into the donut from both sides at the same time. And it wasn't designed for this challenge. So to me, if there's any hope in this image, it's that we need all the creativity and the experimentation and the practice that is out there. And we need it now. We need new policies, new models, new alliances, new stories, new metrics that are fit for these troubled times. Now, as we're discussing today, we all know that humanity is not a single entity. So this global picture is missing some very important context. So there are vast inequalities in the lived experiences of people both within and also, of course, between countries in terms especially of responsibility for the excess emissions and resource use that are driving climate and ecological breakdown and the capacity to meet the needs of their residents, especially given the
Rencontrer
extractive
les besoins
legacy
de
of
ses résidents
colonialism
et surtout
and
étant
the
donné
excessive debts and
l'historique où
austerity
euh,
imposed on
la
countries
dette
through neoliberal
austérité qui est
adjustment.
imposée
For the
dans
last
des
couple of
pays,
years.
bien sûr, sur le
So I think that
programme
there's now plenty
néolibéraliste.
of evidence
Alors, je crois
to
qu'il y a
show
beaucoup
that debt and
de preuves
austerity are
maintenant pour
Que
generally
muestra que la
more
deuda y la
destabilizing
austeridad
than beneficial, both
desestabilizan más las
socially and
cosas
ecologically,
en lugar de
especially for the
ayudar a
worst
solucionar
off.
la
Now,
situación,
I won't read everything here, but a
especialmente para
few
los países más
illustrative examples.
pobres.
For climate,
Voy a darles
we see more
algunos
than
ejemplos. Para el clima,
90%
vemos que
of the
más del
climate vulnerable
90%
countries were
de
either
los
in
países que
or
son
at
vulnerables al
significant
clima
risk of
tienen más
debt distress, according
riesgo
to an
de
ActionAid
tener
report. And yet, the
una presión
OECD
de
reports that 70% of climate finance to low and middle income countries in 2022 was in the form of interest-bearing loans. Now, if we look more in the social domain, the Who Owes Who report that David led on that I mentioned earlier, it finds that well over half of lower income countries spent more on servicing their external debt than they did on either healthcare or education. And when it comes to peace and justice, to date there has not been a single fossil fuel executive who has been detained for their role in causing and profiting from the climate emergency, as far as I'm aware. And yet, thousands of people have been arrested, and charged for peaceful protest against climate inaction. And we're witnessing a rise in anti-protest legislation and increasingly repressive police powers being enacted in many countries that can be linked to a coordinated global network of neoliberal think tanks that's called the Atlas Network. So if we just look at a few examples here, there are many ways to illustrate interconnections between climate and debt and other dimensions of the donut. But I find, of course, this complexity, it can start to get overwhelming. So one way to cut through a bit of that complexity is to unpack and make visible cross-country differences by zooming in on a core domain of the donut, such as climate change. And this is what we did in this study, which is called Compensation for Atmospheric Appropriation, that I wrote together with Jason Hickel, where we analyzed responsibility for climate change across nearly 170 countries. And we started, really two core principles. The first, recognizing that the planet's atmosphere is a global commons. It's a gift from the living planet that everyone should be able to access equitably and sustainably. And the other core concept is that we know from climate science there's only so much carbon that can be released into the atmosphere to achieve a given climate target, such as keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the core goal of the Paris Agreement. So the other core concept is this notion of a remaining carbon budget. So we divided up total carbon budgets for 350 parts per million of CO2, as well as the 1.5 degree and 2 degrees warming across countries. And we divided those up based on population sizes, where we really wanted to know how much each country has emitted in comparison to their fair shares, historically from 1960, and also looking forwards to with a business as usual scenario and a scenario where it decarbonizes from current levels to net zero by 2050. That's a bit of the what we did, but what we really find is shown in this chart. At the global scale, we can see from 1960 to around 2020, historical emissions is the black line, and then afterwards, the blue line is the net zero scenario, and then business as usual scenario. And we can see from these results that the 1.5 degree fair share is the yellow line. If we were to follow the net zero scenario where all countries decarbonize by 2050, the world as a whole could actually limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is crucial to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. But of course, we know that the world, once again, is not a single entity. And we find that the global north, which includes 39 countries in our analysis, it's the EU, the United States, and other wealthy nations, would overshoot its collective share of the carbon budget by 3 times in this scenario. So this is even if we were to achieve a very ambitious climate scenario, the global north would overshoot its fair share by 3 times, thereby appropriating around half of the global south's fair share in the process. And this is at the core of the injustice, in my view. It's deeply unjust, as it effectively forces low emitting countries to mitigate far more rapidly than would otherwise be required, foregoing their own fair shares of the atmospheric commons just in order to balance the excess of over-emitting countries. And that to me is a strong argument for compensation. And this is where we use carbon prices from IPCC scenarios that limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And we valued those excess
1 minute,
emissions.
Andrew.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you.
got you. Cool. We valued excess emissions in monetary terms and calculated $192 trillion would be owed by the over-emitting countries to the rest of the world to compensate for their excess. And we proposed a mechanism that distributes these funds to low-emitting countries based on how much of their fair shares would be appropriated. So if a country has more of its fair share appropriated, then it would be entitled to receive more compensation. And similarly, if a country has overshot more of its fair share, it would be liable to pay more compensation. And if you look at that in an annual basis, we find around 6 trillion per year, or around 4 trillion to low and lower middle income countries would be owed in terms of this compensation. So if we get into the implications, is 4 trillion a lot? I think the answer there is both no and yes. So we can look at industry revenue, for example, in a single year. looking at weapons, tobacco, gambling, and alcohol, those direct revenue of those sectors which are generally not seen to be welfare benefiting are already very much more than 4 trillion. Fossil fuel subsidies, when you take into account the indirect subsidies of the impacts on health and social and ecological costs, surge beyond 7 trillion thanks to an IMF report. And critically, through wealth taxes, a study built on our national scale results and found that a 3.5% yearly wealth tax targeting the richest 10% in the global north could more than raise that 4 trillion amount. So not such a big number in the big scheme of things. But on the other hand, if we look at the level of commitments being floated at the level of the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage or the new collective quantified goal, we can see that the current commitments are less than 1% or around 5% respectively. But similarly, the cost of servicing all external debts to lower income countries that is paid annually is actually also less than 5%. So in this respect, we can see that the debt that is being owed is actually much greater than the climate debt that should be compensated in return. So I know that I'm already late on time. I wanted to wrap up with a very, very quick call to action that if we see, based on these results, three core trajectories based on the country performance of how they're doing with respect to meeting the needs of their residents within the means of the living planet, how can they rise up, reorient, and critically reduce? And most fundamentally to the conversation here, rebalance this global economic system and recognize that there's much transformative action that's needed within, but also, of course, between countries. And I know there's lots of very, very master organizers who will follow up next, and I'm very much looking forward to listening and strategizing with you all. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That's great. And yes, please do share those slides. We'll make sure that those are circulated. I don't know whether we can put a link in the chat or something like that. Well, let's figure that out if we can. I think people will want to study those figures much more closely, which is something I have done and was the basis of that Who Owes Who report, where tried to compare the climate debt with external debt. And for all low and lower middle income countries. And, 1.4 trillion, sorry, yeah, 1.4 trillion is the total debt owed by all low and low income, low middle income countries. And that compares to the climate debt that is owed to them of 107 trillion. So the climate debt owed to low income countries is about 70 times greater. And on an annual basis, the figures are very, very stark. But we have one huge climate debt that goes unenforced and unpaid, and external debts that are brutally enforced. And so we're going to now move over to Rebecca Tisson from the Climate Action Network, who have been very actively using this data. And maybe you could say something, Rebecca, to begin with about how how the Climate Action Network used the concept of climate debt in the context of advocacy, particularly at COP29 in Baku, around the setting of a new collective quantifiable goal for climate finance.
Thanks, David, and thanks so much, Andrew, for the very insightful presentation. So indeed, I think the concept of the climate debt was really the foundation of our work, not only last year around the big pay up campaign we did on the road to COP29, but as a foundation of our work when it comes to climate finance. So we use it really as a moral framing, I would say. But maybe before diving into the NCQG and what happened or did not happen in Baku, just maybe resituating how the climate debt is translated into the UNFCCC, so the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, and how it is actually materialized. So in 1992, back in the days in Rio, countries managed to adopt a very important principle under that convention, which is called the common but differentiated responsibility, which is for us one way to understand the climate debt, right? Countries have all an obligation to do something about climate change, but of course recognizing that some countries, naming the global north countries, have a way bigger responsibility in causing that crisis in the first place. They bear bigger responsibility, both in terms of taking the lead in decarbonizing the economy in the first place, but also providing financial support to developing countries, recognizing that they have this climate debt. So this principle is really key and central for the climate regime, alongside with another key principle that is equity, of course. The problem is that years after years, we've seen, on one hand, the G77, so Global South groups, really fighting hard to keep those principles at the heart, right, of climate action, of course, supported by civil society. But on the other hand, Global North government attempting in any way they can to delude, to erase those references to their historical responsibilities. And that's very noticeable if you just look at the Paris Agreement. That's already much weaker in terms of equity and that references to the climate debt. But that's even more clear when you look at the result of the NCQG. So I think we have to be very mindful of what is at play when it comes to the climate debt in the context of the climate negotiation, and really intentionally fight back to recenter that at the core of climate action, because justice and equity are not just, one add-on when it comes to the climate conversation. It's actually the fundamental principle that will lead to a global just transition. So when it came to the NCQG specifically, as I said, we really use it as a moral framing. So situating the new climate finance goal within that wider context of the climate debt. And when you do so, the perspective and the expectation of the climate finance goal are, of course, very clear. You can't expect loans to be used to repay your debt, right? You can't expect private sector to take the lion's share when we're talking about the public climate debt. So it really helped us to set the clear moral grounds for that new climate goal, but also to be very clear and fighting back, again, a lot of the tactics we were seeing at play by the Global North, such as the question of expanding the contributor base. So, many governments from the Global North were arguing that now everybody should be equal when it comes to providing climate finance, and many developing countries should also be paying. But if you take the climate debt as your starting point, this is, of course, not right. Similarly, when we were discussing the quantum, so how much finance should be owned, when you take the climate debt, it's clear that it's the range of the trillions, right? Because there is this historical moral component of the conversation. So I think, it really helped us to navigate, although I know the results were really disappointing, but also looking forward within the COP space, but also beyond. We have to remember and stick to that principle of climate debt.
So that's great. But you could say something more broadly now about how you see the connections between the action on debt justice and why that is important for the climate justice movement. How you see some of those connections more broadly.
Well, I think you actually did already a great job in introduction. But of course, taking some points from you and Andrew, it is clear that working on debt justice, on climate justice, is actually fighting against the same system, right? Capitalistic, extractivist, colonial system, rooted in the same logic. So I think when we are activists for justice, we don't pick what justice we fight for, right? We are organized and we need to work beyond those silos and actually tackle power in the first place. But more specifically, when you look at the climate nexus and that virtual circle, there are many ways to look at it, and you were alluding to that. But one, as you said, that reduce public spending and investment, whether it's on health, education, but also on climate action. So Global South countries are investing 5 times more in the debt repayment rather than in climate action, and knowing that there is, of course, an emergency to invest in the just transition. There is also the component of the highly inadequate climate finance landscape. So we were talking briefly about the new climate finance goal, but this is not new. Climate finance has been debt burdened, right? Debt burdening for developing country, knowing that 2/3 of climate finance are providing into loans. This is, of course, going against any principle of climate debt. But also, the amount, the quantum we are talking about are largely inadequate. And so it's ending up having Global South countries paying 2 times more in debt servicing than receiving from climate finance. So we're going to net outflows rather than, getting more money to invest on the ground. Of course, you said it, that is also trapping countries into fossil fuel production. Also, I think the consequences of the intensifying and more frequent climate impacts is very important to take into account when it comes to the nexus between climate and debt, because countries have to very quickly borrow more money for recovery and reconstruction, but that's also making them more vulnerable and therefore more higher borrowing costs. And also maybe something important to flag, and I'm sure my colleagues will deep dive into that, is the role of global north governments still investing a lot in fossil fuels abroad, but also certain institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF pushing countries to extract their resources and to continue to extract more and more fossil fuels, but also incentivizing them to not invest in renewables and just transition program. So that's really creating, of course, a virtuous circle, very clearly.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Look, we are going to have to wrap up this segment for in a moment to move on. But perhaps you could just say something about, do you think these connections are widely understood in the climate justice movements, and do you see opportunities at COP30 to advance further on the debt justice? COP30 coming up in Brazil at the end of this year.
Very briefly, I'd say yes, but not enough. We definitely need to build more bridges and synergies across movement and understand what systems are behind those two crises. So using COP30, but also other spaces to make that clear. One clear avenue, just to give one example, would be to really be intentional to exclude loans from climate finance landscape to worsen that crisis, but also for the climate movement to support a UN convention on sovereign debt, for example, really connecting the fight to make it kind of inevitable that those crises are connected and that we're talking about the same systems.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. A good listen forever, but let's move on. We wanted to now move on to hear a little bit more about the opportunities that are presented at the end of this month. We have the UN in Financing for Development Conference, the fourth in a cycle of UN Financing for Development conferences, where the international financial architecture is potentially up for some critical analysis and alternative propositions being put on the table, including around the debt architecture. So we have two colleagues who are going to present or give us a sort of an overview of debt in the context of that Financing for Development conference, starting with Jason Braganza from the African Debt and Development Network, AfroDAD. Jason, are you there? And could you give us your sort of take on where things are at this moment in the Financing for Development process, and what opportunities there are of shifting that architecture, which is doing so much damage at the moment? Jason.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David, for the opportunity. And let me thank the initial two presenters for setting such a wonderful scene on the data and the statistics on how these two issues actually intersect, and the opportunities that are there for us to make sure that these intersections get closer together and a lot more tighter in terms of the advocacy and the arguments that we're making about why you cannot disentangle the two issues of addressing the climate emergency that is affecting developing countries, particularly those in Africa, as well as the debt crisis, which again is also affecting several countries in the global south and particularly in Africa. In terms of where we are in process, we're deep into the negotiations of the fourth Financing for Development outcome document. There is a huge ambition that has been placed on this conference to have a comprehensive, fair, transparent, and democratic global South-led UN Framework Convention on sovereign debt, and a process that takes away the contradictions that exist with the current process under the common framework, where you have certain creditors, for instance, the IMF, also acting as mediators or arbiters in debt restructuring. So one of the big things that we do want to sort of demystify and get rid of in debt restructuring is this conflict of interest, which tends to breed a creditor-centric debt architecture, a creditor-centric debt restructuring process that prioritizes the needs of creditors over that of borrowers and citizens who tend to pay the price for borrowing. But in terms of decision making, one of the most important dimensions of this financing for development process is to get a comprehensive package under a UN Framework Convention on sovereign debt. And what this looks like is a legally binding process that is intergovernmental in nature. So sort of very similar to what we've experienced with the UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation, where you have, all countries being able to sit down and negotiate on equal footing. If you've got interest groups like the Africa Group or the group of countries of small island states, their voices are heard with equal vote and with equal power, as opposed to the current state of play where the current debt restructuring architecture is limited to dealing with a case-by-case basis. So there's really no space for coordination, for collaboration between borrowing countries in this regard. So we are deep in those negotiations, and we're very much encouraging those who are on this call to look at the work that the Civil Society Financing for Development mechanism is doing on advancing a lot of this. This is the last 2 weeks for the push. So it is the UN Framework Convention on Sovereign Debt, an intergovernmental process for getting this UN Framework Convention. And then very lastly from Africa is to look up the African Union Commission's conference on debt that took place in Lomé, Togo, the declaration. There is a specific paragraph, I think it's paragraph 48, that calls explicitly for the establishment of a UN Framework Convention on Sovereign Debt. But throughout the Lomé Declaration articulates the shortcomings of the current debt architecture. Thanks.
Thanks, Jason. I'm going to come back to you with one follow-up question, which is, look, we know that the African group at the UN played a pivotal role in driving a vote at the UN General Assembly to create an international, the UN Framework Convention on international tax cooperation. If we don't get an agreement at financing for development in Seville, what opportunities do you see? What appetite do you see across African nations to take that to a UN General Assembly vote where they have had a track record of winning and pushing that reform, even if it doesn't come out of FFD?
I think the important thing is to understand that all of this is a process. The most important thing is to secure the language in the FFD outcome document as strong as possible and to be as ambitious as possible, as has been the ask, not just of civil society groups, but also the UN hierarchy. So certainly pushing to get the language in the FFD outcome document, which will then lay the foundations towards using different avenues within the UN system, whether it's the General Assembly, whether it's the Second Committee, and so on, to ensure that we get these things moving. But the most important battleground right now is ensuring that the language in the outcome document is able to facilitate that throughout post-Sevilla and post-June or July. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jason, and thanks for joining from your car, wherever you are at this moment. Really appreciate it. Look, we know, and we're going to move on to Yolanda now from Eurodad, because we know that European nations have been some of the most active in blocking progress towards progressive language on an intergovernmental process leading to a UN Framework Convention on debt. What's the latest, Yolanda, and what can we do about it?
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I think, as you say, the EU, not only the EU, UK, Japan, all the creditors, but particularly the EU have been playing all throughout the negotiations since the beginning, like a blocking role on any kind of transformative reforms in the FFD negotiations, particularly on debt. In one meeting, they told us, no way we're going to support a convention, no way we're going to support an intergovernmental process. However, that is still in the text, not the convention. And we need to push for the convention to be explicitly there. But a mentioning on an intergovernmental process that then could lead, and we could push on the definition of a TORs of this intergovernmental process could lead to a convention is still there. So, I mean, they are in minority. That's the magic about the UN. It's not a creditor-controlled space like the IMF or the G20 or the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable. Those are the spaces that today, up to now, decide on the debt architecture. And what we're trying to do is shift that into a more democratic and equal space where the creditors don't have the majority. The EU has been trying to put on the table offers, and I'm using the quotes here, on, I don't know, promoting debt swaps, promoting climate and other state contingent clauses. These are clauses in the debt contracts that can offer a debt payment suspension if an exogenous shock like a climate impact occurs. These are very insufficient and even inadequate tools, and they put them on the table as if it was a big generosity action. They instead, like, or to counter the Global South proposal of an intergovernmental process towards a convention, as Jason was saying, from the Africa Group, from small island developing states, AOCs, from countries like Pakistan, even Brazil supported that explicitly. To counter that, the EU offered an annual dialogue with the Paris Club, as if the Paris Club is the club of the creditors, of the Western bilateral creditors, as if they were not part of the UN. I mean, all of the members at the Paris Club are members at the UN. So they were offering like a dialogue of the UN with the Paris Club, trying to protect that status quo, that space of power that they think they still have. And I'm saying they think they still have because with China being the main bilateral creditor, the Paris Club becomes less and less relevant every day that passes. So they were trying to say, yeah, here is our offer against your proposal on the intergovernmental process. Obviously, this was rejected, and this is being rejected not only by civil society, but also by borrowing countries. And let me finish by pointing at other things that are being discussed on debt, which are interesting also from the climate perspective. For instance, there's this discussion around responsible lending and borrowing. So the proposal includes a working group. We're not so happy with the working group. We prefer intergovernmental member state-led processes on responsible lending and borrowing, which if it happens and it seems that it might get approved, it could also lead with discussions around what in the UNFCCC process is being discussed on what it's called the 2.1c article, so sustainable finance. So from the debt perspective, what is responsible lending, also considering the climate element? That is an interesting thing that we could work on as a civil society, also to put on rules to avoid greenwashing with green bonds, and to ensure that these clauses that they are promoting are not just a voluntary thing, but something that needs to be included in all debt contracts, etc., etc. Other things that are being discussed on the table is the push for legislation in key jurisdictions. This seems to be still in the text. To work on an agreement to, I think it says explore or something like that, but to work on the UN Convention on Corruption to make corrupt debts unapplicable. So unenforceable. It's a very difficult English word, unenforceable. A debt registry. We've been calling for a global debt registry for a long time. now. This in the agreement. Unfortunately, the World Bank is claiming that for them. We wanted an independent debt registry, not a creditor-dominated debt registry, but that's on the document as well. So several things in the document that if it gets approved, depending on the final language, I think as civil society and together with borrowing countries, we can work on. And finally, the other reference that is being discussed, and I think it's going to make it through, is this idea of a borrowers coordination platform, what we call the Borrowers Club. So recognizing the need of a borrowers club, which could also be very interesting for Global South countries. So I think
That's great. I mean, it's so much about the power dynamics, isn't it? So you really want all of these things. You can talk about responsible lending and borrowing, but if it's not actually embedded in a UN member state process, then actually the question of enforceability comes up, and whether or not actually these have any weight. I mean, I was fascinated by the question of a borrowers club, because that sounds like a nice cozy thing, but actually, if you really did get lots of borrowers together who are in debt crisis, one of the most likely things that most of those people might collectively demand is a much more radical debt cancellation, and particularly in the context of a Jubilee year. And do you see in much appetite for collective action from across borrowing countries to either declare that they can't pay their debts, or to build momentum around the idea that rich countries owe us a climate debt, they're not paying that debt, we have external debts that are massively undermining our capacity for climate action and for investment in health and education. We can't pay our debts until you pay your debts. Do you see any appetite, any space for that sort of thinking?
Maybe my colleagues from the Global South will have more
And Jason, please come in on this.
Insights on that. I think for the moment, the Borrowers Club, if anything, also to avoid scaring everyone else, creditors particularly, is being presented as something like to support in negotiations, in bond issuance, in exchange of information, not so much as a platform for a collective default. But obviously, if borrowers have a platform to get better coordinated, then there are more chances that they can get to that point. I don't think they are at that point, but Jason or Carola or Emilia, please correct me if I'm wrong.
I would be interested to come, and maybe that can be something picked up. And Jason, if you have any thoughts at this moment as well, or we can come back later. I just think this is a very interesting one, given the scale of the debt crisis, the momentum for resolution. And we know what happens when people declare that they want to, default on the debts. We know what happened with Thomas Sankara in the past. The question, I think, is, can this connection with the climate crisis create a slightly different atmosphere? Because we have two debts, one of which is being paid and one of which is not being paid. And the one which is not being paid is much greater than the debts that are being brutally enforced. And I think there's a power in looking at those two things together, and it might embolden people to be bolder in saying we can't pay our debts because we have a climate emergency. We need to invest in our own spending. That's something for building in the longer term. We might come back to that. But thank you very much, Yolanda. Really excellent to get an overview of where things are in FFD, and thank you, Jason. I want to move perhaps on then to look, there's so many different ways in which climate and debt are interconnected, and different lenses that we think need to be brought into this equation. So one of the things we'd like to do now is to go to Maria Rombalcera from the Center of Economic and Social Rights, who can perhaps give some reflections on the links between the importance of taking a human rights and public services perspective on. Over to you, Maria.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you very much, everyone, for the excellent presentations. This is a great opportunity to talk about how global debt pressures fuel austerity, constraining public services, and worsening the climate crisis, and of course, undermining human rights. And I will also try to offer some potential solutions for a rights-based economy, which is something that the Center for Economic and Social Rights have been working on for a decade. So the debt crisis is real. It has been discussed by the previous presenters. I'm just going to remind you some of the data that put forward. And it is that in 2023, the developing countries hit the external debt of 11.4 trillion US dollars. Right? And this is the equivalent of 99% of their export earning. And in 2023, the net interest payments soared up to $847 billion, which is a 26% rise since 2021. Right? And that over 38% of developing countries allocated more than 10% of their revenues to interest payments. This is money diverted from health, education, and climate resilience, and this is eroding basic rights. Absolutely, I completely agree with the need to be shifting the narrative of who owes who. But at the moment, this is what's happening. And particularly the mantra that the IMF keeps imposing of fiscal consolidation and austerity continues to have an effect in terms of violating human rights. Because to have access to credit and meet debt obligations, countries are forced to impose fiscal consolidation, which are budget cuts and austerity measures. But decades of research shows that austerity often violates human rights because they undermine social spending, employment, healthcare, education, and the right to an adequate standard of living. It also derails countries from social and economic development, condemning generations to lower levels of well-being, social unrest, and lack of a flourishing future in their country. The human rights principles of non-retrogression demands that states must not roll back protections or public services unless they are fully justified, proportionate, and ensuring that the maximum available resources are mobilized. When we are talking about the maximum available resources, they also include tackling tax abuse, which at the moment is estimated to be $500 billion US dollars every year. Also illicit financial flows and harmful tax incentives. Debt repayment must not trump human rights. Previous speakers have already made the link between debt and climate. And we know that almost half of low-income and debt-distressed countries are also highly climate-vulnerable countries. And they are caught in this vicious cycle that Rebecca talked before of the climate disasters and rising debt and being forced to invest more on fossil fuels and industrial agriculture. This is not a technical issue, right? It is a question of justice, but also human rights law. And that's why we are talking about convention, why we are talking about legally binding, because human rights are an underutilized tool for these demands. Human rights mechanisms have denounced that debt-related austerity can constitute retrogression, which is a clear violation of the under international human rights law, because states are obliged to use these maximum available resources to realize their rights to health, education, social protection, and a healthy environment. In terms of the solutions, some of them have already been mentioned. In terms of the UN Convention on Debt Sovereignty, the support of a UN Framework Tax Convention, also the protect the fiscal space, ensuring that all these debt repayment include a human rights impact assessment, and prioritizing grants and public climate finance. Just to conclude, excessive debt and austerity shrink fiscal space and erode public services and breach human rights. But states, and this is very clear, are bound by international law to invest the maximum available resources and avoid retrogression. There is an urgent need to reposition human rights at the heart of the global economic governance. Debt repayment must never supersede a state's legal duty to guarantee the economic, social, and environmental rights of its people. Human rights obligations require governments to allocate all these resources. And existing debt restructuring mechanisms are clearly failing because of their ad hoc, opaque processes that overwhelmingly favor creditors and perpetuate cycles of unsustainable debt. This is the moment to reclaim multilateralism for the people and the planet, and particularly the FFD4 could lay the foundation for a just, inclusive, and rights-based global economy, one that renews trust, delivers fairness, and secures sustainable future for all. The FFD4 could mark the start of a new era, one where finance serves people, rights come before profits, and multilateralism work for all. Let's join forces to to make sure that to push for debt architecture reform, climate-sensitive financing, and rights-based budgeting. We can all do it. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. And look, yes, let's hope we can get all of that from FFD. There's a lot of aspiration, but it's important to build momentum on all of these issues and to understand those connections, because I think it's when you understand the connections that you start connecting the different movements, the human rights movements, the debt and climate justice movements, but also I think women's movements and feminist movements are a critical part of this, because actually the evidence is very compelling that the people who are most systematically disadvantaged and excluded as a result of both the climate crisis and the debt crisis are women and girls. And we have with us Amelia Reyes from Equidad. I know you were in a car. I don't know if you're you're not in a car any longer. So over to you, Amelia, to give us an overview of how you see some of these connections.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you to everybody who's been in this amazing call with great speakers. Before I start, I just wanted to express my solidarity with the Palestinian people who are facing a horrible genocide while Western countries continue with their imperial project. This is part of a larger demand for social justice that is also related to climate justice. I also wanted to say that from our end on working on structural feminism, we do also work with the framework of planetary boundaries and the global south analysis. This means that the notion of ecological debt should be expanded into not only remaining in the issue of climate finance, but to understand really that the global north has doing a lot of harm, destroying, threatening the life across the world, mostly in the global south. So Andrew already has said that the global north is responsible for 92% of excess carbon emission. It's also responsible for 72% of resource extraction. 50% of it is extracted from the global south, which has a larger impact in destroying the biodiversity. So I just really wanted to point out that the debt discourse without this larger framing will just imply that it's global south countries who have been borrowing and they don't have the means to pay and now they need to pay. Is really the opposite. The global north has a historical ecological debt to the world, especially to the global south. It has to pay. It is a matter of reparations. It's a matter of justice. And therefore, not only debt cancellation is due, but also the step towards a framework convention on debt sovereignty. And this is why initiatives, that's my personal view, initiatives such as the Debtors Club is actually adding again the burden on global south countries, requiring of them more boldness, more informal responsibility, while governments in the global north need to be very clear that a framework convention on sovereign debt is the right step, and it will add a democratic floor for addressing all of these issues that the former speakers have been saying. Having said that, of course, women are the largest guardians of biodiversity, of the life on the planet, due to the sexual division of labor, and also due to androcentrism and the structural inequalities between women and men. And so women are on the receiving end of the largest negative impacts of the climate crisis and the larger ecological breakdown. Also, women generate 60% of the value that circulates in the world, upholding the ecosystems, alongside actually indigenous peoples. So I just wanted to emphasize very strongly that the capitalistic system exists thanks to the theft that it does to, on the one hand, unpaid domestic and care work, labor that is done by women, but also the exploitation of natural resources, most of them under the guardianship of indigenous peoples. So this is really a larger macroeconomic agenda. This is not minor thing. This is not about how much debt servicing is one country paying, and if they cannot do that, then we're negotiating one-on-one to reduce the interest rates. No, this is really a systemic and macro agenda that has to be very clear for everybody. And so this is why we want to call for systemic transformations. And also, it has been mentioned already that the issue of debt comes hand in hand with austerity. We actually call it austericide because of the larger impacts it has, not only on the economic or environmental side, but also depleting the entire roots of the state, with social protection, reduction of poverty, guaranteeing human rights and the quality of life for so many people that are also living intersecting forms of discrimination. So this is a very serious thing. And I think debt and austerity cannot be separated as different problems, because when countries come into debt, they are imposed conditionalities that are colonial and imperial in nature, and they need to reduce social spending, including spending on climate action. So everything is interconnected, but it's part of a bigger systemic problem that we need to tackle. So I just really wanted to say that on the point of view of a feminist analysis, women are shock absorbers. Every crisis that comes just adds the burden of the women in informal labor, formal labor, unpaid labor, etc., but especially women in the global south. So I just want to point out that global north countries are the largest violators of human rights of women in the global south. And that has to be said very clearly, especially women in poorer countries that are most impacted and also have more indebted crisis. There is indeed a limitation of the UNFCCC climate finance in the face of debt justice. This is why FFD is a better space to address the larger notion of debt justice, especially addressing the Framework Convention on debt, on sovereign debt. But indeed, climate finance within the UNFCCC is key to achieve climate justice. And so we are demanding, for instance, direct access to women, to indigenous peoples, the most impacted communities. And Rebecca has already addressed some of the larger demands. I know Carol and Mariana will go further, but I just wanted to say from a systemic point of view, also, we want to have a system change. Feminists have been calling for that. And more specifically as well, we want to call for degrowth for the global north and the linking from the global south, from the global north, from capitalism and from imperialism. Happy to address many of these points in further elements in the conversation, but also very glad to hear that there are a plurality of voices in this webinar that can also address these issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amelia. I think that's really, really great, just to really remind us of that, those connections. And look, one of the struggles, I think, and we'll move on now to hear from Bhumika Muchala from the Third World Network, because one of the critical parts of the global financial architecture that goes sort of unscrutinized, unregulated, is the private credit rating agencies. And yet they play a very toxic role in the connection between the climate crisis and the debt crisis, as Bhumika is going to explain to us over the next 5 minutes. Hopefully. Can we? Yes.
Yes. Thank you so much for the organizers. This is a fantastic seminar right now, so very critically needed at this juncture, and really happy to be with all of you, longtime colleagues and friends. So credit rating agencies is at the fulcrum of the debt and climate nexus. And it is also one of the key players in financial hegemony and the kind of supranational governance exercised in wholly unaccountable and untransparent ways vis-a-vis the financial market power over nation states. So the purpose of credit rating agencies is ostensibly to act as a bridge between lenders and borrowers. Its primary concern is the creditworthiness of the borrower nation. By creditworthiness, what is meant is simply and precisely the ability of a state or a firm to observe its obligations to the debt. So the risk of debt default, that's really the singular thing that is measured. The key channel of the effect of credit rating agencies, as David has mentioned in the beginning of this webinar, is on the costs and terms of borrowing in external financing. In other words, the access and affordability to international capital markets. In this sense, market access is wielded as a disciplinary power, as a sort of a threat, a constant omnipresent threat that is wielded by rating agencies, which is essentially market access to capital. There are many observations of the critiques of rating agencies. I will just go through a few. The first and foremost is monopoly formation of 3 agencies, all headquartered in New York. The 3 dominant rating agencies are Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch. They control more than 94% of outstanding credit ratings today and in the last several decades, in fact. Second, a conflict of interest. These agencies issue judgments to the very financial clients who pay them for the assessments. So this is called the issuer pays model. It raises critical questions over the objectivity, motives, and legitimacy of the methodology. So the methodology has really come under scrutiny. The lack of inclusion in their secretive rating committees, the biases that go into it, the lack of time they spend in the country. Third, procyclicality. This has been called by scholars on credit rating agencies the downgrade austerity vicious circle. So this austerity bias is baked into the methodology. Austerity bias is viewed as credit positive. Conversely, spending measures to facilitate economic and social recovery from crises, any kind of spending measure is assessed credit negative. Obviously, this creates a pro-cyclical dynamics that we really saw during the COVID pandemic. Exogenous shocks are penalized by rating agencies. So 11 countries during the COVID pandemic saw their rating downgraded during the first half of 2020, and 12 countries had their outlooks changed to negative. This is the words of the Financial Times in June 2020. Spending what is needed on pandemic stimulus can invite ratings downgrades. So in essence, credit rating agencies are embedded within, funded by, and accountable to creditors. Consequently, rating agencies are pressured to promote the very policies that maximize client profits and market share. So the influence wielded by rating agencies is this supranational and unaccountable governance mechanism of markets over states. So in 2014, beginning in 2014, a concept called the climate credit score was first outlined by Standard & Poor. And as of 2018, climate risks were being integrated into the 4 key risk factors used in sovereign risk analysis. These 4 factors very quickly is economic strength, fiscal strength, institutional strength, and susceptibility to event risk, meaning susceptibility to climate risk. However, in 2016, in a report on assessing climate change for sovereigns, Moody's admits to making quote unquote, explicit downward adjustments to account for country vulnerability to climate change. In other words, downgrades are made preemptively on the basis of climate vulnerability alone, regardless of an actual event of a climate disaster. Examples of this vulnerability encompass island nations, agriculture-based, weather-sensitive economies, and tourism-based economies. I mean, this is a good majority of the global south. So the rating methodology highlights 2 key measures of this climate vulnerability. First, a country's exposure, and second, its resilience to climate change. Now, according to both Standard & Poor and Moody's, exposure to climate change is a function of national economic diversification and geographic location. Resilience is a function of adaptive capacity, fiscal flexibility, as well as the country's income and development levels. These criterion are deeply problematic. Geographic location is beyond a nation's control. Economic diversification, adaptive capacity, and fiscal flexibility are duly handicapped by a range of international structural constraints, from trade and investment agreements that block the ability for value chain upgrading and infant industrial policy and economic diversification, to the austerity agenda across macroeconomic policies, and the consistent pressure exerted by rating agencies to maintain that fiscal discipline. I'll give you 3 short country case studies before I conclude. Pakistan. Pakistan had devastating floods in October 2022. Despite its greenhouse gas emissions amounting to merely 0.3% of the global total, the floods submerged 1/3 of the country, claimed the lives of almost 2,000 people, displaced 33 million people, killed over 2 million livestock, and destroyed precious infrastructure. The World Bank said approximately 9 million people were pushed below the poverty line, exacerbating already high food insecurity in 2022 due to the food price surge and inflation spike. And in this context, Fitch Ratings downgraded Pakistan's rating from B- to CCC+. this specific technicalities are not as relevant as Fitch's claim that widespread flooding in Pakistan would undermine Pakistan's efforts to control its fiscal and current account deficits.
I think that's a brilliant case study, but I think we might have to leave it at one case study because otherwise we're not going to have time for other colleagues to speak. Any final word, Bhumika? But otherwise we will have to move on.
There are so many various case studies, but that is a case in point. Droughts in Namibia, hurricanes across small island development states, and to conclude in the financing for development conference space, the civil society have been consistently advocating for an intergovernmental commission under the Economic and Social Council to regulate, monitor, and hold accountable credit rating agencies. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And look, if anyone wants to have further work, recommend the writing you've done on this and others. But it's so important. I think FFD is an opportunity both on the regulation of private credit rating agencies, and there's talk and momentum building around the need for a public credit rating agency. So I think there's some opportunities there. We're not going to win everything overnight, but we can build momentum on these things. So thank you very much, Bhumika. And I want to move on then to Esther Agaya from the Debt for Climate. And this is just a reminder that people have been working on the connections between debt, the debt crisis and climate crisis for some time. And most notably, in fact, the Debt for Climate have been great activists and mobilizers on the connections between these struggles. So over to you, Esther, to say something more about how that's going.
Yeah, thank you very much, David, and to all the speakers, especially for sharing those data and lending their voices on the issues that is going on in the Global South. Yeah, I mobilize locally represented Debt for Climate, as you've mentioned, and we're a decentralized grassroots global movement that puts those most affected by debt and climate crisis at the center of resilience. I am a Nigerian, and as a Nigerian, we're a country that lives this crisis daily. So it is not just about data. It is not about conversations that people, the previous speakers have talked about. But then Nigeria as a nation is choking under debt. We are drowning in floods. We are burning in it and paying this debt with our survival. We are in a moment of global reckoning, and this kind of webinar is very important at this time. The climate emergency and the debt crisis are not separate. They are symptoms of the same extractive system that is rooted in colonial violence. This is enforced by profit-driven institutions and sustained by consistent silence. And so when we have different people, both the global north and south, lending their voices to this issue, is a great encouragement to people like us who are living this crisis. Movement mobilization is our collective refusal to stay silent and would continue to lend our voice to this. Nigeria is rich. We're rich in oil. We have human capital, biodiversity and the likes, but debt seems to be like a virtuous cycle for us where each government continues to take more loan to clear a loan, and this has continued over the years. In 2024, Nigeria spent a total of 13 trillion on debt servicing, and that's like 68% increase from 2023. So if we've had continuous increase like that, it means 2025 might just be another worst case for us. So what do we borrow this money for is to repay colonial debt, pay loans, and then we take more loans year in and year out to build resilience against the climate crisis or the issues that we did not even cause. So mobilization is not just about protest or petitions or about webinars and seminars. It is about building power from below, like if I'm in Kenya and there's a jubilee of workers going on in Germany, in United Kingdom, it is about me in Kenya also building forces to raise my voice and lend my voices to this issue, or maybe students in Nigeria who are organizing parallel actions to protests going on in the UK, or we have people in Zimbabwe, Uganda, Zambia occupying streets, while others also hold actions in Sevilla as we are preparing for the FFD4, all of us making the same demand. Africa is spending more on debt repayment than on health, education, climate adaptation, all combined together. And The global south, as I said, is trapped in a circle of dependency. So we depend more on the global south to keep lending us money, and it seems we are being kept in like a pit hole where we take on more debt in order for us to find a way to survive. And that is why we are coming out to say we're mobilizing to give more voices to us when the institutions are failed. It is a moral force that challenged the G7 hypocrisy to expose the failure of the IMF and the World Bank, and also to demand a UN framework convention on debt rooted in human rights and climate justice. I'll talk briefly about our role because of time.
One
The
minute
FF
most.
all right, yeah. FFD4 process, the movement like us, we are watching closely and we are connecting the dots from the depth negotiations to COP30 discussions and also towards G20. The fight is bigger than any government or panel. It is about reclaiming the future. And we cannot wait for permission from institutions who created this crisis, which is why those who will be present in Sevilla for the FFD4 to organize actions, same as those who are locally to also organize to build from below. And to those who have joined today, I saw we have a good number of people who joined this webinar. Mobilize in your city, lend your voice, push your government also, and stand in solidarity with those on the front line. Debt cancellation is climate action, and if you are based in Global North, you have a role too. Hold your government accountable, share these discussions, talk about these stories, these data with them, and support our actions, amplify our demands. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Esther. And look, it's been really impressive, the level of mobilization of Debt for Climate, and very excited about what's going to happen in Seville and in many other cases. And as you referenced yourself, look, this is a Jubilee year, and we look at the Jubilee campaign from 25 years ago that took a few years to build up enough critical momentum to achieve in 2005 the cancellation of $100 billion of debt. One of the greatest lessons from that, I think, is that they cancelled $100 billion, but they didn't change the system. And we are now in 2025 back into a deeper debt crisis in many cases. So this year, this Jubilee campaign will only really take off when we broaden the alliance beyond faith-based groups into wider movements, and with a clear demand that it's not just about cancellation, it's about system change. It's about changing the architecture. Now, we're going to have a few final words. We've got three more people who are going to say a few words. First of all, Mariana Paoli from ActionAid, who can perhaps say something about the Jubilee campaign and where that is, but you may want to pick up on any other gaps on the connections between debt and climate that you feel haven't come through strongly enough so far. Over to you, Mariana.
I guess for me, it's mainly about a reflection on where we are in this moment in time. We heard so eloquently here about all the challenges we have in terms of addressing the debt and addressing the climate and how they are intertwined. And for me, it's much a bigger picture on how and what we have to do to really increase the pressure on the global north, especially in North America, in Europe, and others, to stop unblocking the system. Because what we see in the UN climate negotiations, and that were some of the results of the COP29 in Baku last year, and in the negotiations this year on climate finance, there is discussions on the roadmap from Baku to Berlin, who are not looking, it's about what climate finance will look like for the next 10 years. And then we have other processes, the FFD, right, is much beyond the SDGs, is also, a benchmark for the next 10 years. So what is at stake is really about reclaiming the role of public finance to deliver climate and development action. And that's why the whole conversation about that in climate comes into the framework to shift the financial flows between North and South, and to end this 2 trillion per year that flows more from the global South to the global North because of our architecture. And in the heart of that, and that's why I think, with FFD and beyond, we have a golden opportunity to democratize economic decision making. It's really about changing these spheres of negotiation to spaces where the global South have more voice and participation. And I think it's quite inspiring. We have already, like, the tax convention under under negotiations. We're fighting now to have this more democratic space to address that. We have the space to challenge the multilateral development banks and international financial institutions and the way they work, and especially looking at the fund and the bank and so lots of their policies are just fueling and driving more inequality and the climate crisis. So I think we have a lot of work in our hands to do in terms of the advocacy that we do in our different spheres, and a lot more cross collaboration between our movements, the economic justice movement, the climate movement, the gender justice movement, and all the others. So yeah, I guess I just wanted to share this reflection. I think, as I was just saying, we need to reclaim the future. We need to reclaim the role of public finance for climate and development. So I wanted to leave it here. Thanks.
Absolutely. And I think really fundamental, put the public finance right at the heart of it. So many of these myths and lies around private finance, the billions, the trillions, even the World Bank chief economist is now saying that's mostly a con trick. If you look at his introduction or forward to the International Debt Report, if even the World Bank chief economist is questioning some of these mythologies about private finance, it really should be dead in the water, and we should be putting the whole energy behind public finance. But I don't think we've got enough there. We need to keep working together to make that happen. Thank you very much, Mariana. I'm going to pass over now to Carola Mejia from LatinDAD, the Latin American Debt and Development Network, for any reflections from your side on gaps or things that you feel need to be emphasized.
Thank you so much, David. Well, I would like to add some 4 extra points and examples from our work that show this interconnectedness between debt and climate. The first one is that the international community is calling for a stronger role of MDBs regarding climate finance. But if we see the quality of climate finance they are providing right now, we need to be very concerned, because in 2022, 89% were mostly non-concessional loans. So it's going to add to this debt burden in global south countries. So at the end, our countries are the ones unfairly paying for the climate debt of global north countries, even with high interest rates. And that is something that should not be happening. So debt is definitely a neocolonial instrument to keep our countries completely conditioned to the interests of the north and to be condemned to extractivism, to export raw materials to the world under very unfair trading practices. So this is the second point regarding this vicious circle between climate, debt, and extractivism. We did an analysis in 5 Amazon countries, and I would like to share the example of Suriname. Suriname had a huge debt, and in 2024, it got a debt restructuring of 29% of its debt with Eurobond private creditors. But the condition was to exploit hydrocarbons reserves, oil and gas offshore, to pay them royalties. So it is not only that we choose to keep extracting fossil fuels to pay our debts, but these creditors use this excuse also to make us go deeper into this vicious circle, and they receive royalties and income from these kind of conditionalities. So the third example is related to the credit rating agencies, as Bhumika was mentioning. And I would like to share the example of Ecuador. Last year in Ecuador, there was a popular consultation to see if people wanted the government to go ahead with exploiting fossil fuels in the Yasuni. They said no. That was the result of the consultation. And after that, Moody's credit agency threatened the government to say and said that if they respected that result, they were going to downgrade Ecuador's credit rating. So that is another example of how they are pushing our countries to keep in this path of extractivism. And the fourth element that maybe wasn't mentioned in this webinar is about loss and damage, and how the millionaire economic losses caused by the current climate crisis in our countries in the global south are covered with more debt. And it is called debt and climate as well. Bhumika was mentioning in the case of Pakistan. After the floodings in 2022, Pakistan received a lot of loans to recover and rebuild the country. And now it was terrible to see this figure. 46.9% of Pakistan's new budget will go towards debt servicing, which is really, really unfair and concerning. And we have to be aware about the new instruments, the new funds that are being out there discussed and negotiated, as the loss and damage fund. it is going to accept instruments like loans. So it is completely unfair and something that we need to be really highlighting and using in our narratives. So I would also like to add something that wasn't mentioned: the use of false solutions. We consider, for example, debt for nature and climate swaps not a real solution to tackle the debt crisis nor the climate emergency. And we have analyzed the case, for example, of Galapagos, and we have seen many problems resulting from these kind of swaps that are, as Yolanda was mentioning, highly recommended in these negotiations of the FFD and other spaces. So we invite you to read all these reports and analysis we did on debt for nature and climate swaps, because we found a lot of problems related to integrity, transparency, high hidden costs, lack of consultation and participation of local communities, and things that we need to be aware of. So we are really calling for debt cancellation, including private, public creditors, and also MDBs. This year, as you mentioned, this is the Jubilee year, and it's a good opportunity to bring this demand from the church and the civil society, and especially to benefit highly vulnerable countries that are highly indebted. We need to reform not only the international financial architecture, but the current climate finance architecture, which has proven to be very insufficient with a lot of problems. And we need also to think outside the box and to find another ways. For example, Latin that was pushing for new issuances of special drawing rights to fund the climate agenda, but under different criteria of distribution that prioritizes vulnerable countries.
Yeah.
So I will leave it there. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you so much, Carola, and so many interesting perspectives on this. SDR is something we haven't talked about, but I think huge opportunities if they're radically reconceived. We're going to have a final word now from Bronwyn. If you have any urgent last-minute thoughts, I'm going to go back to all of the any other panelists you want to come in right at the end with a sort of 30-second final reflection. But first, we're going to go to Bronwyn, and I'm just sharing in the chat some of the resources that she's going to be mentioning. So over to you, Bronwyn.
Thanks so much. I'll be really quick because there's been so much. Yeah, I think people have really covered a lot. I just wanted to share maybe some things that could be helpful. And so I think one is there's certainly a ton of other debt mobilization going on, but one is this Global Days of Action from June 27th to 29th. And there's just the kind of toolkit about that mobilization in the chat. And then, yeah, going to kind of the, I think I'm in Canada, certainly something we hear all the time is we don't have money to pay for things, even at home, let alone sending money overseas, which is ridiculous. And so there's this handout kind of showing how the global north can raise over 5 trillion a year just from defunding harmful economic activities, let alone the other tools that are available. And then secondly, just on climate and coming from an organization that focuses on oil and gas, just also a paper showing how 5 global north countries alone make over half of the planned oil and gas expansion to 2050. And I think a funny thing that's happened to me before with this paper, or these 2 papers in conjunction, talking to decision makers, is policymakers saying, "Oh, well, great, then the global south doesn't need money for a fair fossil fuel phase out or just transition," which obviously is not the case. I think Carola covered really well how the economic system is really pushing countries to still expand fossil fuel infrastructure. And I think it just speaks to the kind of scale of extraction in the global north being so much larger. But we know there's just many countries in the global south that are also that are locked into fossil fuel production. Maybe one other example of that happening is with the International Monetary Fund. Kind of in the years after the Paris Agreement, there's a great study showing how they included conditions pushing the expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure in 55% of member countries. And so those links are very much in place. I'll end there just so there's a bit more time for questions. Thanks, everyone.
Look, thanks so much, Ron. And we're trying to post some resources in the chat. Panelists, for some reason, can't post things themselves, so they have to send it to me, and then I post it for them. But there are 4 or 5 questions, and I'm wondering if anybody from here. We've only got about 3 or 4 minutes left, so there's not a lot of space or time to answer the questions in detail. But did anyone want to come in and answer any of those questions that are posted there live, or meanwhile you could also make a written response as well. There are so many different dimensions to this, so I'm waiting to see if either wants to answer any of the questions or make a very short concluding contribution, because we are now in those last couple of minutes. So if you do want to make a final reflection or contribution as a panelist, please sort of stand up and shout now. I can't see everyone very clearly. So Mariana.
Hi, David. Yeah, I just wanted to flag, as you know, we are approaching next week the UN climate negotiations mid-year happening in Germany, and FFD a few weeks away. There is quite a bit of actions that people can take. So just wanted to share, maybe you can put it on the chat, a toolkit on reclaiming the role of public finance that we have organized. There's like communications package, you know, with different actions planned. So yeah, if people do want to get involved, let's push our governments, let's work together to increase the pressure and this month. So I think lots of opportunities, and let's find a way to put the link in the chat. Thank you so much.
Trying them though, we have Yolanda.
Similarly to what Mariana was saying, there's going to be there's a call for days of action, particularly on FFD between the 27th and the 29th of June. So inviting everyone to join online, or it's going to be decentralized, or you can organize an action in your city. There's a question on alternative ways or innovative ideas to generate funds to support debt relief. I wouldn't say funds, but to generate pressure to support debt relief, we need massive mobilization. I think the mobilizations on FFD4 and Jubilee 2025 and on debt and climate around the Bonn intersessionals or COP30 are a first step of increasing mobilizations that we need to put together in the next months and years if we want to put pressure on creditors to actually cancel the debt massively and agree on those systemic changes that David was mentioning. Because as we know, canceling the debt is not enough. We need a system change. So mobilization, and mobilization. That would be my answer to that question.
Yes, and I think I'd agree. Mobilization is hugely important, but also we do need people who are working inside those negotiations all the time. People like yourself, who we've got to keep that pressure on inside all of the processes, whilst also getting extra momentum from external pressure and mobilization. So it's something which we're really trying to prioritize. Certainly as an ActionAid, we have national dialogues and mobilizations going on across 20 countries this month. Really trying to put pressure on national governments to think in a bolder way about financing for development, which includes a climate perspective. And I think many other agencies are. And one of the challenges is how do we get better at all coordinating with each other? There have been slightly different initiatives. The Global Call for Action Against Poverty have been mobilizing in one way with many allies, then the Fight Inequality Alliance with another group of people, and APMDD and others with us. In the end, the bottom line messages from pretty much all of them are the same, that we need to cancel the debt and achieve some system change. And I don't think it matters necessarily who's the leading one particular initiative or another, but at country level, let's just connect and collaborate behind that mobilization and popular pressure, because that does play a critical role, both in the global south in terms of putting pressure on governments to take bolder national decisions and bolder positioning in the international arena, and in governments in the global north to live up to the debts that they're paying. And particularly, I think, in the context of so many governments in the north cutting their aid budgets, making progress on debt and ought to be an integral part of a responsible way of behaving. I mean, not much of a history of responsible behavior from those global north governments, but there is something to be said for saying, let's look at debt and what we can do on debt, because that triggers sustainable financing for countries, which is on a much bigger scale than aid. Carola, I can see you. We are going to have to wrap up in a moment, but whilst people are still hanging on, we'll just hear for a few more words.
Thank you, David. I just want to invite people interested in these topics to be part of this working group. We have a global working group on debt and climate. So if you're interested, please write to me, Yolanda, Rebecca. And there it is a very good opportunity to discuss these topics, share information, and then strategize towards these big events and spaces that we are participating in.
Absolutely. And look, it's been one of the exciting things about sort of bringing together this as a webinar has just been how much convergence and connection there is between the climate movements and the debt movements. I think we're at a genuinely exciting moment where we can make some significant breakthroughs, because our voice is always going to be stronger when we are more united. And so a huge thanks to everyone who's been involved. Thank you to all of the panelists. It's been really interesting. I've been learning things throughout this webinar. It really valuable. We will try to make sure we can share the recording of the webinar with everybody who was registered, and whether that includes the chat, I've got no idea. I'm not a technical person, but we'll try to figure out how to share some key resources as well. And just a reminder that this is a sort of warm up for what we will be doing in a side event, an official side event at the Financing for Development Conference in Seville. We will, which is on the 1st of July at 4:30 p.m. in Auditorium 3, for those of you who are going to be in Seville. And I think we will hopefully have a couple of member state representatives there as well. But I think it's a really important moment for us to show that we are understanding the connections and not just thinking about what we can do at FFD for itself, but thinking about what we can do subsequently, whether through a UN General Assembly, through COP30, or in other spaces. Because in one way or another, building the momentum, building the understanding, building the consensus around what needs to be done across our different movements is a really, really major step forward. So thank you, everyone. I think we should wrap up now, but let's all just wave goodbye to each other and say thank you again. It's been lovely, and I look forward to seeing most of you hopefully in Seville, and we'll be communicating further on that shortly. So thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you,
Ciao.
David.
Have a nice
Wow.
Thank you,
day.
David. Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you. Bye.